Hi, I'm DJ Ware. On this episode of the CyberGizmo, we're going to continue with Linux backup techniques, and we're going to continue on by talking about Rsync right after this. So last time we kind of touched on Rsync a little bit. I told you that Rsync was really meant to be an incremental backup and a full backup utility as well, and it's really built for that. But before we really delve into how to use the tool, let's talk about some of the things that it actually will do. So the first thing you need to know about Rsync is that it is a utility you will have to install. On most of the Linux distributions that I have encountered, Rsync is not there, so you have to install it. And that'll depend on the distribution you have. You can use the package manager that's under your interface, your user interface, or you can go to the command line and use either apt if you're on a Debian or Ubuntu style system, Linux Mint, something like that. But if you're using Fedora or Red Hat or CentOS, you'll need to use DNF to do that, that install. And of course on Arch, you'll need to use Pacman to do that. So check your distribution if it's different than one of those and see how to install Rsync. I'm not going to cover that today because there's just too many ways to do it. So basically what Rsync does is several things. First, it allows you to keep two directories in sync. So you can sync from a source directory to your destination on your local system, or you can sync from your local system over to a remote host. You can do the opposite as well. You can sync from the remote host to your local file system as well. It's very trivial to do that. It does transfers to a remote host using one of three methods. And those methods are, you can use SSH, which is secured shell. You can also use remote shell, or RSH. Or you could use the Rsync daemon. Yeah, it has a port that's open on it that will talk directly to an Rsync client on another host. However, I don't the only recommended way I would say to use Rsync over to a remote host is use SSH. There's several reasons for that. One is all the R commands are garbage for security. They're old. The security methodologies they use are easily subverted, and the data going across the wire is not encrypted. So I don't recommend that. And I'll talk a little bit more about the Rsync daemon being used through its TCP/IP port when we get to that. So what are you going to learn? What are you going to get out of this? So basically the first thing is how to copy files locally from one place to another. The other one is I'm going to show you how to copy from a local system over to remote. Now, I'm not going to show you the opposite because it's really kind of trivial. All you got to do is reverse the destination and the source commands. So I don't really think that's really worthwhile doing. Also, I'll show you how to back up to a disk or to a USB stick. Now, USB has some special things you might want to consider, and I'll cover that when we get there. Also, there's ways that you can include or exclude files in the copy. So even though I set it to a particular path, there's ways that I can tell Rsync to ignore files but through the exclude. And if there's things that are not in my path that I have specified, there's ways to include those as well. Also, you can display the file progress. So if you want to do that, there's a command to show you the progress of the file as it goes. And the Rsync command, this is from the command line, you would do an Rsync command, of course, and then there are three other things that you need. Now, options are not required, but they really are. I mean, if you really want Rsync to work well, you do have to include some options to make it work. And I'll show you what those are. Also, you need a source directory or a source file, and you need a destination directory or a destination file. The first one that's the most common one to use is the archive, or the -A. It's kind of really misleading. It's not really saying I'm doing an archive. It's just giving you a bunch of options that are kind of grouped together to form a single option that you can include in the command line and get all those other features out of Rsync without having to specify individual options to do it. So the archive command contains the recursive option What does that mean? It means that if I have a source directory and I don't have recursion on, it means that it'll go to that source directory. It'll copy the source directory name over to the target, as well as any files which are immediately under it. But if it encounters a directory, it skips it. It won't copy it because the recursion was not on. So the recursion option allows it to, when it hits a directory that is underneath of the source, it'll copy that as well as the contents. It'll also find any subdirectories that are below that and copy those over. So you get everything that's under that that beginning source location, and it'll copy everything over. And so that's what that does. There's also it also includes preserving the permissions on the file. So typically what would happen in Linux, if you write a file, the UMask comes into play, and that is how the file is written. But if I have the archive bit set on, then the preserved permissions are also kept. So if I have a file, if let's say I have a UMask of 022, which is pretty common, then instead of having, and I have a file that maybe is read, write, execute for the owner, maybe is read only for everyone else, and maybe for the world it's nothing and don't allow any access at all, that permission would be preserved onto the destination folder. That's all it means. Also, it preserves the file modifications, date, and time. So normally Linux will change that depending upon if the file has been touched or accessed or created. And in this case, it uses the creation date or the modification date that is in the actual source directory to control which gets written into the destination. And Rsync takes care of that automatically. It also preserves the group and the user ownership. Now, one thing to keep in mind here is, I always laugh because I have hit this myself. If you do use that, if you do preserve the group and UID, make sure the systems group and UIDs are the same. It does use the UID, which is the numeric form, to match up the user IDs. So when you are copying this over to a remote system, you might be opening up permissions that to other users or other groups that you did not intend to have permission to access those files. So just be aware of that if you're going to a remote host, make sure that your UIDs and GIDs are in sync. The other thing is it also preserves special files and devices. Those are markers in the file system or the inode table that identify a file as a special file and also as a device. So just keep in mind that Rsync can handle that. It can copy those, and then so those are preserved. So if it is a special file, it won't change it from a special file. It will retain it as a special file. Same with devices. If it is a device, it gets retained as a device. And of course, we talked about recursion already. The -R is how to specify that if you're not using the archive bit. There's a -V, which is a verbose mode that just shows you a list of files as they're copied from the source over to the destination. There's also a --delete, and that creates a perfect copy, a perfect synchronization between your source and your destination, which basically means that default case, if I don't specify --delete, if let's say that I did a backup on Monday, I had all the files in there, they got transferred over to my destination files, great, all happy, good. And maybe this morning I come in and I delete some files out of the source. If I don't have -delete turned on, when Rsync runs, it'll see that there are differences in the file system between the target and the source, but it won't do anything with them. So in other words, any files that are not in the source directory that are in the target, Rsync leaves alone, doesn't touch them. But if I have the --delete on and there's files that are missing out of the source that are in the target, Rsync says, oh, I need to make a perfect copy, so I'm just going to delete the files that are in the target directory that aren't in the source. So that's what that does. So it keeps it a perfect copy. Also, you have the -Z option, so that's useful if you're sending stuff across the wire. Any non-binary files are compressed. Now, Rsync is smart enough; it knows how to recognize binary files, like PGP or PNG or JPEG files. So it knows that those are binary files, and it won't attempt to compress them. If you know much about compression algorithms, when you're compressing binary files, you get unintended results. Instead of getting a smaller file, you end up with a larger file. So Rsync is smart enough to recognize binary files, and it will not compress. The include options are minus include that specifies a pattern, a file pattern or directory pattern, and it adds it on to the list of files that Rsync is worrying about copying. Exclude takes the list of files that Rsync is working on, and it excludes those files. Same thing, it's a pattern that you can include and pass to Rsync to just say, hey, this group of directories or this group of files I don't want. Minus dry run, it's kind of helpful if you're setting up a new Rsync command string and you want to check it out but not actually execute the output and store it. So that actually allows you to run through the Rsync without actually writing anything out to the destination directory. Minus progress shows the progress of what's going on in the system, and it's actually more helpful to me over remote than it is for local. But I'll show it to you on the local as well, so you can use that if you want. There is a directory a file that gets created in the Etsy directory called rsyncd.conf. That contains the configuration for the Rsync daemon, which is the service. I don't advise really messing with that too much, because what I'm going to show you today is just the SSH. I don't recommend any of the other options, and the only reason you would want to modify anything in there is if you were using RShell or you're using the TCP/IP port directly from the Rsync client over to the Rsync server. I don't recommend any of either of those two methods, and the reason for that is the security model on all the R commands is weak. The files are sent over the wire encrypted, and the second problem is you're opening up yet another TCP/IP port. Only this one is designed to exfiltrate data. So this is probably not something you really want to do. You're opening up another port, but this one is really designed to go after and just pull data out of your system. But it also is designed to inject malware into your system, because it also allows data to come in. And so, no thanks. So I don't mess with that. But if you want to play around with it, be my guest. I'm not going to tell you how to work with it. You can look at the man page for the rsyncd.conf. It'll give you a lot of information in there about how to configure the Rsync daemon. There are some things you might want to do in there, like change where the log file directories are and so forth. But, what I'm talking about is going in and actually having the UID set up and all that stuff for the security. No thanks. I don't want to do that. So how do I perform a local backup? It's very simple. I put an rsync command. I do a -abp archive, verbose, and progress. And then I put in the source directory, RPM packages /, and then I put in the name of my destination, which is destination /, and then it'll start copying. It'll compare the two files, the two file systems, and it'll copy files that aren't there in the destination, and it'll also, if that old destination is empty, so it'll create a full backup for me. So the next time I run, it picks up just the changes and moves those over. That's it. So you have a real incremental backup with the first time you run it. It's automatic to do a full. Nothing you have to do. It all comes right out of the box, just the way it is. Rsync over SSH. So what's happening here is, yes, you're using insecure Rsync protocols to an Rsync daemon. Absolutely. But it's encapsulated inside of an SSH tunnel. So that's the advantage here is you have the ability to send Rsync commands over to the Rsync daemon, but it's encrypted. So that's basically the nuts and bolts of it. How do you set it up? You do an rsync minus, you can do ABP, ABPZ. Z is to do the compression, as you probably remember. I give it the name of my source file, RPM packages, and a /. And then I'll put in a string that looks like an SSH connection. It's the user ID @ the name of the host, a colon, and then a /. Now I have home. It should be RPMG packages, but yeah, that would then synchronize the RPM packages with the remote host RPMG packages as well. So what does it do? It logs in the user on the remote host as an SSHD session. It then starts up the Rsync communications between the client app that I'm running on my local host with the Rsync daemon on the remote host. and they start making a list of files to check to see which ones need to get copied, and it starts to compress on the client, and it sends it across the wire. When Rsync on the client is done, it's reached its last file, it disconnects from the Rsync daemon, and then it disconnects from the SSH session, closes the tunnel, and then it exits. Done. All done. That's all it does. That's very simple. There's a lot more going on under the covers, but I'm not going to cover that today. I'm just going to show you the basics. So what about performing backups to a disk or a USB? Yes, absolutely, you can do it. However, there's some notes, some things you want to think about. And I'm picking on NFS here, but I have run into these same issues with Samba as well. They're a little bit different in the error messages, but the net effect is neither one of them can handle special devices, special files or devices. So, and I have run into problems with NFS where it did not copy files that I really wanted to copy across because the protocols were different. It didn't support it. Absolutely, you can get around it using configurations. I know that. Problem is that 3 weeks later, something else will pop up and it'll fail. And I run into that repeatedly as well. So I don't recommend that you use NFS. I don't recommend that you use Samba as your output directories. Why? They're slow. That's the main reason. You can get more speed out of going direct to the Rsync, using Rsync over SSH than you can using NFS or Samba because the locking protocols that those two use are inefficient and they're slow to do mass copies like this. So that's my 2 cents. You can use it if you want, but I guarantee you'll run into issues with it, and I don't recommend it. So the command to do a copy from to a drive, it's pretty similar to everything else, except that I'm doing the Rsync ABP from my source directory to my destination, and the destination includes the mount point of where that device is actually mounted to the file system, as well as the directory, the RPMG packages. So it isn't too difficult to do that. And it uses the same method, whether it's SAS or SATA drives or NVMe drives that are connected locally to your system, or whether it's a USB drive even. But there's some things you probably ought to consider if you're using USB drives. First, the first thing any security audit will do when they're going through your system is they'll tell you to disconnect the USB device drivers and the FireWire device drivers because those are ways to attack your system. If an attacker has local access to the machine, they can inject malware through a USB port. And so every security audit I've ever seen, that's the first 2 things they tell you to get rid of. If you want to use them, and they are convenient, won't deny that. It's very convenient to have USB ports open on your system, and but it's a security issue, and that's all I'm telling you. I'm just telling you that that's an issue that you should be aware of. So let's look at excluding files. This is my command on how I do things, how I actually do a full system backup over the wire. Yeah, it's actually going to a local file system in this case. So this is an Rsync, and I have the -A, and you'll notice I have a capital A and a capital X, and then a V. So the -AV, and I could put a P in there for progress too if I wanted. The 2 commands, capital A and capital X, were to get around problems with NFS. Those will allow me to preserve the attributes and the extended attributes in Rsync. It didn't work. It worked for a while, but it didn't stay working. So yeah, those should be gone. I should get rid of those out of the command, but that's the way they're in there today. I do an exclude from. You can do a -- exclude, but then you have to list all of the files that you want to exclude from the backup. I just create a file. I put that on a share, and all my systems use exactly the same exclude because all my mount points are exactly the same on every server that I have. And it starts with the /, which is the root file system, and then it will copy the user3 rsync /$hostname. And that'll make a full backup of the system or a full incremental backup of the system depending upon the state of the destination, as we had talked about earlier. So there's a couple of things you want to consider. Make sure that your destination directory is in your exclude file. And the reason for that is You are writing to the file system. Rsync is looking at the changes, and it will continue to back up until you run out of disk, or it just sits and spins and spins and spins. So the first thing I include is the destination. I don't want to back that up, obviously. And then in my case, I have a service directory that I use for Gluster that mounts the bricks, the individual drives, into the Gluster cluster. It's not recommended that you back those up that way. They're totally useless if you do. They recommend a different way to do backup, but so I exclude the service directories. Your system may be different. I don't back up the swap files. All the system files like dev, proc, sys, and run, I don't back those up either because they get recreated, or just scratch areas that are used by the system. The dev are recreated automatically. All the devices are created automatically when Linux boots anyway, so I don't need that. The temp directory, there might be times where I might want files out of there. If I do, I just put them in an include and add them to the list. But for the most part, temp files get deleted when you reboot your machine anyway, so I don't really need those either. As for the mount and media points, I do not mount any local file systems to that. Those are to me are reserved for remote, and so I don't want to back those up because my philosophy is to back up on the system where the files are sourced. So I don't back up across the network and then push it back over to another remote machine, for example. That seems a little inefficient to me. But anyway, on the opposite side, you have the include file. Now this, like I said, was in addition to your starting directory. So in my case, I have an Rsync ABP include, and it's a capital R star, which says, go look through the file system where we started, the Rsync, find any files that have a capital R in it, and add them on to the list of files that I want to copy. Now, I immediately followed that one. This is a kind of a special case with an exclude, but I wanted to show you how you can use the two commands together. A minus exclude, it says to not copy anything else on the file system. Now, even though I'm starting at root, what I'm really doing here is I'm searching my entire file system for files that begin with capital R, and I'm copying them to my backup. That was the intent of this command, and this is a way you can use Rsync to do that. So it's just showing you how to use both of them together. Also, the delete option, we talked about that, and all you have to do is specify --delete. That'll create a perfect sync between your source and your target directory or your destination directory. That is it. So I think with that, what I'm going to do is kind of review. We looked at how to copy files locally, how to copy files to remote. We talked about some of the options that you have with Rsync and why you don't want to use them. I'll repeat them here. Don't. SSH is the only option you really should be considering. You just have so many more security options with that from the standpoint of being able to, if you want to use user logins with SSH, you can do that. If you want to use encrypted keys, you can use that. If you want to use LDAP, you can use that. If you want to use Radius servers, you can use that. So you just have a lot more security options than you do with if you want to use two-factor, you can do that too. You just have a lot of security options that aren't available in the older utilities that were written 40 years ago now. All the R commands came up around 40 years ago, and they haven't changed a bit on how they do their security models, and they're really bad. The other thing is we talked a little bit about some of the options you can use with Rsync and how you can modify the selection path for what files it's going to copy. We talked about that. And then we also talked about how to create a perfect sync. So I think today, I'll end here. If you have any specific questions about Rsync, leave them in a comment below. And of course, if you have any other comments in general about the video, let me know. Always happy to hear from you. And with that, I'm going to sign off today. Hope to see you again real soon. And please like and subscribe as always. And bye for now.